The morning of June 27, 1976, broke with the characteristic heat of the Mediterranean summer as the Air France Airbus A300 began its takeoff procedures at Ben Gurion International Airport in Tel Aviv. What should have been another routine commercial transport operation between Israel and Paris, with a technical stopover in Athens, would be transformed into one of the most emblematic episodes of the war against international terrorism and the operational capacity of Israeli special forces. At that moment, as passengers settled into their seats and the crew completed final checks, no one could imagine that they were about to become the protagonists of a geopolitical drama that would echo through the following decades. The international context of that period offered a particularly volatile scenario for such incidents. The Cold War had created an intricate board of alliances and proxy conflicts, where terrorist organizations found logistical and political support in regimes aligned with the Soviet Union. The Middle East, in particular, had become a cauldron of tensions, where radical Palestinian groups established operational partnerships with European far-left factions, creating an international network of terror that challenged the response capabilities of Western security services. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, known for its spectacular and symbolic operations, had repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to attack civilian targets to maximize the media impact of its actions. The takeoff of Flight 139 occurred without incident, following the established commercial route toward the Greek capital. During the first hours of the flight, the atmosphere on board remained within the normality expected for an international trip of that duration. The initial 248 passengers, comprised of tourists, business people, and families in transit, were occupied with the usual activities of a commercial air journey. The French crew, commanded by Captain Michael Barkos, operated the aircraft with the professional competence characteristic of the French national airline. In Athens, as per the operational plan, 58 more passengers boarded the aircraft, raising the total number of people on board to 306 individuals. However, among the new passengers who entered the aircraft during the Athenian stopover were 4 individuals whose intentions drastically diverged from the other people present on the flight. 2 Palestinians linked to the external operations section of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine had managed to board using falsified documentation, accompanied by 2 German militants belonging to the Revolutionary Cells, a far-left terrorist organization operating in West Germany. This international collaboration between terrorist groups of different ethnic and ideological origins exemplified the growing sophistication of the terror networks that emerged during the 1970s. Approximately at noon, after the flight had been underway for a few hours without incident, the 4 terrorists simultaneously began the execution of their meticulously prepared plan. Armed with pistols and grenades that they managed to introduce into the aircraft through failures in the airport security systems of the time, the hijackers took control of the passenger cabin in a coordinated operation that left crew and passengers in a state of shock and panic. The speed and determination with which they acted demonstrated the level of preparation and training received by these operatives, who had clearly rehearsed every aspect of the operation. Commander Bakos, confronted with the direct threat to the lives of the passengers under his responsibility, had no alternative but to comply with the hijackers' orders to drastically alter the flight route. Abandoning the original destination in Paris, the aircraft was redirected to Benghazi, in Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, a regime that maintained hostile relations with Israel and offered material and logistical support to various Palestinian terrorist groups. During the 7 hours the aircraft remained on Libyan soil, the hijackers allowed fuel to be added to the tanks, preparing for the next stage of their operation. During this period of tension at the Benghazi airport, the terrorists demonstrated a combination of strategic calculation and psychological cruelty. They released a pregnant passenger, who managed to convince them she was suffering a spontaneous abortion, a desperate tactic that illustrated the climate of absolute terror dominating the passenger cabin. The other hostages remained under constant armed guard, subjected to extreme psychological pressure while awaiting developments whose outcome remained completely uncertain. After refueling and the necessary logistical procedures, the aircraft took off again from Benghazi, this time heading toward a destination that the hijackers kept in absolute secrecy. For over 12 additional hours of flight, passengers and crew remained in a state of total suspense, without any information about their final destination. This strategy of keeping the victims in complete uncertainty constituted a fundamental element of the psychological warfare conducted by the terrorists, maximizing the traumatic impact of the experience on the hostages. Finally, on the afternoon of June 28th, more than 24 hours after the initial takeoff from Tel Aviv, the Airbus A300 touched down on the runway of Entebbe International Airport, located near the Ugandan capital, Kampala. The choice of this destination proved to be strategically calculated by the operation's organizers, as Uganda was under the control of dictator Idi Amin Dada, an eccentric and bloodthirsty figure who had recently realigned his international alliances, abandoning Western support in favor of partnerships with Arab countries and the Soviet Union. The arrival of the hijacked aircraft in Entebbe did not come as a surprise to the Ugandan authorities, evidencing a level of prior coordination that suggested direct complicity between the hijackers and Idi Amin's regime. Ugandan army soldiers awaited the arrival of the flight, along with 4 additional terrorists who joined the original 4, significantly increasing the group's operational capacity. This organized reception unequivocally demonstrated that Uganda was not merely functioning as a destination of convenience, but rather as an active partner in the terrorist operation. The hostages were immediately transferred to the airport's old passenger terminal, a disused facility that offered ideal conditions for keeping them under armed custody. The deteriorated and isolated structure of the terminal facilitated the control of the prisoners while hindering any attempt at rescue or escape. Under constant armed guard, the 306 hostages faced precarious accommodation conditions, limited food, and the growing psychological tension of a situation whose outcome remained completely unpredictable. The next day, June 29th, the hijackers issued their demands through international diplomatic channels. They demanded the payment of $5 million for the release of the aircraft, in addition to the immediate release of 53 Palestinian militants held in Israeli and other countries' prisons. The deadline set for meeting these demands was July 1st, creating an extremely restricted time window for any kind of negotiation or governmental response. The explicit threat to begin executing hostages if their demands were not met dramatically raised the stakes of the situation. In Jerusalem, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's cabinet received the news of the hijacking with deep concern and an initial feeling of helplessness in the face of the geographical and political complexity of the challenge. Uganda was thousands of kilometers from Israel, far beyond the conventional operational range of the Israeli armed forces. The central location in East Africa, combined with the manifest hostility of the Ugandan regime, seemingly made any military rescue operation virtually impossible to execute successfully. However, even in the face of seemingly desperate prospects, Defense Minister Shimon Peres immediately ordered the Israeli armed forces to initiate a detailed analysis of military options for a possible rescue operation. This decision reflected the Israeli national security doctrine, which emphasized the state's responsibility to protect its citizens regardless of the geographical or political circumstances involved. Peres's order signaled that Israel would not passively accept terrorist blackmail, even if it required military operations of extraordinary complexity and risk. Simultaneously with the initial military planning efforts, the hijackers implemented a segregation strategy that clearly revealed the underlying anti-Semitic motivations of the operation. On June 29th, all Israeli and Jewish passengers were separated from the other hostages and confined to a distinct section of the terminal. This ethnic and religious selection echoed sinister historical precedents and demonstrated that, in addition to the declared political objectives, the operation carried an ideological dimension of systematic racial hatred. The next day, June 30th, the terrorists released 148 non-Jewish hostages, including the sick, the elderly, and mothers accompanied by small children. These individuals were transported on an Air France Boeing 747 back to Paris, where they provided French and Israeli authorities with the first detailed information about the internal situation at the Entebbe terminal. The accounts of these former hostages offered crucial data on the number of terrorists, their weapons, the security conditions of the site, and the physical layout of the facilities. Meanwhile, traversing the dusty roads of the Sinai Peninsula on a routine training mission was Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu, commander of the Sayeret Matkal, the elite unit of the Israeli Special Forces. Netanyahu, a 30-year-old veteran with proven experience in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, had assumed command of the prestigious unit just a few months earlier. Older brother of the future Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Yonatan had a reputation for exceptional leadership and tactical competence that made him the natural choice to command any high-complexity rescue operation. The urgent news of the hijacking reached Netanyahu through his deputy commander, Major Muki Betzer, who maintained direct communication with headquarters in Tel Aviv. The immediate call for Netanyahu and his unit to return to base evidenced that the Israeli military command was already seriously considering the possibility of a military response to the hijacking. The operational experience of Sayeret Matkal in deep infiltration missions and special operations made it the most suitable force to face the technical and tactical challenges of a possible rescue operation in African territory. Curiously, among the Sayeret Matkal officers was someone whose specific experience would become fundamental to the operation's planning. Major Muki Betzer had previously served as a military instructor in the Ugandan army during a period of cooperation between Israel and Uganda prior to Idi Amin's ascent to power. This first-hand knowledge of the capabilities, training and morale of the Ugandan armed forces would provide an invaluable intelligence advantage for any military operation in Ugandan territory. The initial analyses conducted by the Israeli General Staff revealed the extraordinary magnitude of the operational challenges involved in any attempt at military rescue. The distance of approximately 4,000 kilometers between Israel and Uganda significantly exceeded the operational range of any Israeli military aircraft available at that time, requiring technical stops for refueling that would drastically complicate the maintenance of operational secrecy. Furthermore, a military operation in Ugandan territory would constitute a blatant violation of the national sovereignty of a United Nations member state, with potential long-term diplomatic and legal repercussions. When called upon to report his impressions of Ugandan military capabilities, Major Betzer offered an assessment that would prove crucial for subsequent strategic calculations. Based on his direct experience as an instructor in Uganda, Betzer characterized the typical Ugandan soldier as generally fearful, inadequately trained, and with low motivation for combat. His assessment suggested that, in a direct confrontation with highly trained and motivated Israeli special forces, the Ugandan troops would likely not offer effective resistance, especially if surprised during a night operation. This military intelligence analysis provided a realistic basis for assessing the feasibility of a rescue operation, contrasting with initial perceptions that any military attempt would be suicidal. The combination of tactical surprise, superiority in training and equipment, and the presumed low morale of the adversary created conditions that, although still extremely risky, made a military operation theoretically executable. However, fundamental questions remained about logistics, aerial navigation, and the capacity to extract the hostages after a successful rescue. The Israeli government faced a complex strategic dilemma between accepting the terrorist demands, setting a dangerous precedent for future hijackings, or risking a military operation with low probabilities of success and potential catastrophic consequences for the hostages. The decision to buy time through apparent negotiations while secretly preparing a military response demonstrated the sophistication of Israeli strategic thinking, keeping multiple options open until the last possible moment. On July 1st, with the hijackers' original deadline expiring, the Israeli government publicly announced its willingness to negotiate the fulfillment of the terrorist demands, requesting additional time to organize the release of the Palestinian prisoners. This diplomatic maneuver had the desired effect of reassuring the hijackers and persuading Idi Amin to push for an extension of the deadline until July 4th. The Ugandan dictator, envisioning an opportunity to increase his international prestige as a successful mediator, agreed to take a more active role in the negotiations. Simultaneously with these public diplomatic maneuvers, military planning for a rescue operation was secretly intensifying. Two main operational concepts emerged from the feasibility studies conducted by the Joint General Staff. The first alternative involved the launching of paratroopers over Lake Victoria, followed by an amphibious approach using inflatable boats to reach the airport from the western shore of the lake. This option offered the advantage of completely avoiding Ugandan airspace, but presented significant logistical risks and depended on favorable meteorological and hydrographic conditions. The second alternative, considered more audacious but potentially more effective, involved the use of C-130 Hercules transport planes to directly transport special forces to Entebbe Airport. This operation would require flying through the airspace of multiple African countries during the night, landing at an airport controlled by hostile forces, neutralizing the terrorists and the Ugandan garrison, rescuing the hostages, and taking off again before enemy reinforcements could respond effectively. The technical complexity and inherent risks of this operation made it almost surreal in its boldness. For Netanyahu and his Sayeret Matkal commanders, both plans initially seemed unfeasible, given the distance involved, the lack of local logistical support, and the uncertainty about the specific conditions in Entebbe. However, as more detailed analyses were conducted and additional information became available through the released former hostages, specific elements of feasibility began to emerge. The first alternative was definitively discarded when Israeli agents in Kenya confirmed that the shores of Lake Victoria were inhabited by dense populations of Nile crocodiles, making any amphibious operation extremely dangerous. During the negotiation extension period, Idi Amin visited the remaining hostages daily at the Entebbe terminal, expressing public optimism about the progress of the negotiations while privately anticipating the political benefits he would obtain as a successful international mediator. These visits provided the hostages with some moments of hope, although the fundamental uncertainty about their fate continued to generate extreme psychological tension. For the Ugandan dictator, the crisis represented a unique opportunity to project himself as an influential African leader capable of mediating complex international conflicts. In parallel, another 48 non-Jewish hostages were released on July 1st and evacuated to Paris, reducing the total number of people held captive to 106 individuals, including the French crew, who had voluntarily chosen to remain with their Jewish and Israeli passengers. This decision by the Air France crew demonstrated an exceptional level of professional solidarity and personal courage that would later be recognized internationally as an example of civilian heroism in extreme circumstances. With the deadline extended until July 4th and increasingly detailed intelligence information about the conditions in Entebbe, the concept of a direct air operation using C-130 Hercules emerged as the only realistic military alternative. Detailed operational analysis revealed that 4 transport aircraft would be needed, 3 to transport the combat forces and their equipment, and a 4th configured as a flying hospital for emergency medical evacuation. The operation would require precise coordination between multiple specialized units, including assault forces, perimeter security teams, demolition experts, and medical personnel. The logistical complexity of the operation demanded meticulous preparation of every technical and tactical detail. Military planners needed to consider not only the infiltration and assault on the terminal, but also the neutralization of possible Ugandan reinforcements, the protection of the runway during takeoff operations, and the possibility that Ugandan military aircraft might try to intercept the retreating formation. Each of these elements presented specific challenges that required innovative solutions and specialized equipment. Intelligence on the specific dispositions in Entebbe constituted a critical element for the success of any operation. Recent aerial photographs of the airport were essential to identify positions of Ugandan troops, the location of the hostages, potential obstacles on the runway, and the most suitable approach routes. Obtaining this information required extremely risky reconnaissance missions that could compromise the secrecy of the entire operation if detected prematurely. In a particularly audacious intelligence operation, Israeli agents managed to infiltrate the vicinity of Entebbe to conduct detailed photographic reconnaissance of the airport. Using high-resolution photography equipment, they managed to document the positions of the Ugandan forces, the exact location of the terminal where the hostages were held, and the general conditions of the landing strip. These photographs would provide indispensable visual information for the detailed tactical planning of the operation. The transfer of these crucial photographs to the operation planners illustrated the urgency and improvisation necessary in high-pressure special operations. When the agent responsible for the reconnaissance managed to return with the photographs, he discovered that the C-130s intended for the operation were already taxiing for takeoff. In a desperate race against time, he managed to intercept the last aircraft still moving, personally delivering the envelope with the photographs that would become fundamental for the final approval of the mission by the Prime Minister. With this intelligence information in hand, Yitzhak Rabin finally authorized the execution of the operation, internally codenamed Operation Thunder. The decision represented a strategic gamble of extremely high risk, in which the Israeli government put at stake not only the lives of the hostages and the special forces involved, but also Israel's international reputation and diplomatic relations with several African countries. The final authorization arrived when the aircraft were already in flight, demonstrating how crucial strategic decisions sometimes need to be made under extreme time pressure. The C-130 formation made a technical stop in Sharm el-Sheikh, on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, then under Israeli control. This forward base offered the last opportunity for refueling before the long crossing to Uganda, in addition to allowing final checks of equipment and communications. During this stopover, many of the commandos suffered from motion sickness due to the prolonged confinement in the overcrowded cargo compartments, requiring medication to maintain their combat capacity. The planned flight route to avoid detection by hostile radar systems required precision navigation through the airspace of multiple countries. Flying at only 30 meters altitude over the Red Sea, the formation managed to avoid Egyptian, Sudanese and Saudi radars. Subsequently, rounding the Horn of Africa, the aircraft passed west of Djibouti, overflew northern Somalia and eastern Ethiopia before entering Kenyan airspace. This complex route required perfect coordination between pilots and navigators to keep the formation together in conditions of limited visibility. Shortly after midnight on July 4th, the Israeli formation finally sighted the majestic Lake Victoria, reflecting the moonlight, signaling the proximity of the objective. Netanyahu, who had maintained composure and confidence throughout the mission, distributed the final tactical instructions to his commandos. Adrenaline now replaced the anxiety that had characterized the previous hours, and all participants in the operation understood that the next few minutes would determine the success or failure of one of the most ambitious special operations ever attempted in modern military history. The information that the Entebbe runway remained illuminated constituted an encouraging sign that the element of surprise had been preserved. If the Ugandan authorities had suspected an imminent military operation, they certainly would have turned off the runway lights and positioned additional anti-aircraft defenses. The maintenance of normal lighting suggested that the Israeli approach had not been detected by the Ugandan surveillance systems, creating ideal conditions for a surprise landing. The final moments of approach to Entebbe Airport passed in tense silence inside the C-130s, with Sayeret Matkal commandos making final checks of weapons and equipment as they mentally prepared for the imminent action. The first Hercules began its final approach to the runway, with the pilots utilizing all their experience to execute a precise night landing at a hostile airport. The characteristic sound of the turboprop engines and the impact of the landing gear on the runway announced to the commandos that they had finally reached African soil, officially initiating one of the most audacious rescue operations in contemporary military history. The infiltration strategy elaborated by the Israeli planners was based on a cunning combination of deception and brute force. A black Mercedes-Benz, accompanied by 2 Land Rovers, had been transported in the first C-130 to simulate an official Ugandan motorcade. This setup was based on intelligence that Idi Amin regularly used similar vehicles for his movements, creating an opportunity to approach the terminal without arousing immediate suspicion. The choice of vehicles demonstrated the meticulous attention to detail that characterized Israeli planning. However, the planners failed to anticipate a recent change in the Ugandan dictator's habits. A few days before the operation, Idi Amin had replaced his black Mercedes with a white limousine, information that did not reach Israeli intelligence services in time to modify the operational plan. This apparently minor discrepancy would create unexpected complications that tested the commando's ability to improvise during the crucial initial moments of the operation. Following the established timetable rigorously, Netanyahu ordered the vehicles to disembark as soon as the rear door of the first C-130 fully opened. The driver immediately accelerated, putting the Mercedes on the runway and driving directly towards the old passenger terminal, where the hostages were held in custody. The two Land Rovers followed in close formation, transporting additional commandos equipped with heavy weaponry and essential communication equipment to coordinate the multiple phases of the operation. The initial approach proceeded as planned until the small motorized motorcade encountered the Ugandan sentinels posted at the terminal access checkpoint. The Ugandan soldiers, observing the approach of vehicles that did not exactly match those habitually used by their leadership, pointed their weapons in the direction of the Mercedes and gestured for the convoy to stop. This critical moment demanded an instantaneous decision that could determine the success or failure of the entire operation. Netanyahu, immediately understanding that the initial cover had been compromised, ordered the commandos positioned in the back seat of the Mercedes to silently neutralize the sentinels using pistols equipped with suppressors. This decision reflected the rigorous training and ability to improvise under pressure that characterized the Israeli special forces. However, only the commando positioned on the left side managed to execute the silent shot as planned. The failure to neutralize the second sentinel forced a commando in the first Land Rover to open fire with his machine gun, effectively eliminating the immediate threat, but definitively compromising the element of surprise. The sound of the machine gun echoed through the airport, alerting the entire Ugandan garrison to the presence of hostile forces. This sequence of events illustrated how complex special operations frequently require instantaneous adaptation when meticulously elaborated plans encounter unforeseen realities on the ground. With the element of surprise compromised, Netanyahu immediately ordered the abandonment of the vehicles and the approach to the terminal on foot. The commandos quickly disembarked and began their advance toward the objective, utilizing tactical movement techniques to minimize their exposure to enemy fire. The transition from a silent infiltration to an open assault required instantaneous tactical readjustments that tested the flexibility and training of the Israeli special forces. During this tactical advance, Ugandan soldiers positioned between the control tower and the main terminal began firing at the Israeli commandos. The Israelis immediately responded with coordinated suppressive fire, using their superiority in training and equipment to gain a tactical advantage. The precision and fire discipline of the commandos contrasted sharply with the disorganized resistance offered by the Ugandan defenders, confirming the intelligence assessments about the limitations of the local armed forces. It was during this initial confrontation that the tragedy occurred that would forever mark the operation. A Ugandan soldier positioned near the terminal entrance managed to fire at the vanguard of the Israeli force, hitting Yonatan Netanyahu just below the neck. The operation commander fell immediately, severely wounded by the bullet that pierced vital arteries. The unit's medic immediately went to the scene to provide first aid, but the severity of the injuries was evident from the first moments. Netanyahu's fall represented a moment of potential crisis for the entire operation, as the tactical leadership had been compromised at the most critical moment of the assault. However, the command structure of Sayeret Matkal and the rigorous training of its members allowed for an immediate transition of leadership without compromising operational continuity. The remaining commandos proceeded with the assault on the terminal, maintaining determination and focusing on the primary objectives of the mission. Simultaneously with the drama unfolding at the main terminal, the remaining 3 C-130s managed to land successively on the Entebbe runway, disembarking perimeter security forces and specialized equipment. This capacity to maintain coordinated operations at multiple points simultaneously demonstrated the sophistication of Israeli operational planning and the competence of the units involved. An Israeli Boeing 707 circled above the airport, serving as an airborne command center and general coordination for the operation. The assault into the interior of the Entebbe terminal was conducted with the lethal precision and efficiency that characterized Sayeret Matkal operations. Major Muki Betze, assuming tactical command after Netanyahu's injury, led the vanguard through the main entrance of the building. The first terrorist encountered was lying on the ground firing his assault rifle, representing an immediate threat to the hostages and the rescue forces. Betze emptied all the ammunition from his AK-47 into the target, neutralizing him instantly and establishing control of the main entrance. The invasion of the terminal proceeded with additional commandos penetrating the building and engaging other terrorists who were firing indiscriminately in the interior darkness. The tactical superiority of the Israelis became evident as they systematically eliminated every point of resistance encountered. Intensive training in urban combat and hostage rescue operations allowed the commandos to quickly distinguish between armed terrorists and innocent civilians, even in conditions of limited visibility and under extreme combat pressure. Using megaphones, the commandos began shouting instructions in Hebrew and English to reassure the terrified hostages, "Stay on the floor. We are soldiers from Israel. We came to take you home." These words, spoken amidst the chaos of combat, represented the first sign of hope that many hostages had experienced since the beginning of their ordeal a week earlier. The ability to maintain effective communication with the victims during active combat operations demonstrated the level of professionalism and preparation of the Israeli Special Forces. Searching the interior of the terminal with tactical flashlights, the commandos located the hostages lying on the floor, with parents protecting children with their own bodies in an instinctive display of family protection under extreme conditions. Absolute terror was stamped on the faces of men, women, and children who had spent days under constant threat of death. When questioned by the commandos, the hostages managed to provide information about the location of the remaining terrorists, assisting in the systematic clearing of the building. The terminal clearing operation proceeded meticulously through the ground floor and the second floor, with the commandos systematically eliminating any resistance encountered. Every environment was carefully checked to ensure that no terrorist remained hidden or capable of threatening the hostages during the evacuation. This process, although it seemed to last forever for everyone involved, was completed in approximately 10 minutes, demonstrating the lethal efficiency of Israeli special operations. During this critical period, Yonatan Netanyahu continued to lose blood rapidly due to the serious injuries caused by the Ugandan bullet. Despite immediate medical efforts and his emergency evacuation to one of the aircraft, he arrived at the plane already deceased. The death of the operation commander constituted a devastating personal loss for his men, but also symbolized the tragic price frequently demanded by operations of such complexity and risk. His death would later be commemorated as the supreme sacrifice in defense of innocent citizens. With the main terminal under Israeli control, Betze formally assumed command of the operation and initiated the phase of evacuating the hostages toward the planes awaiting on the runway. This transition represented a delicate moment, as the hostages needed to be moved quickly through an area potentially under enemy fire. The discipline and organization maintained by the commandos during this evacuation were fundamental to avoid unnecessary casualties among the victims who were finally being freed. Simultaneously with the operations at the terminal, other Israeli units attacked the Ugandan military garrison's barracks, dispersing and discouraging any attempt at organized resistance. The strategy of coordinated multiple attacks prevented the Ugandan forces from effectively regrouping or mounting a counteroffensive that could compromise the evacuation of the hostages. This capacity to maintain simultaneous operations at various points demonstrated the sophistication of operational planning and the competence of the different units involved. The sergeant driving one of the Land Rovers, noticing machine gun fire coming from the control tower, took the initiative to neutralize this threat to the operation's safety. Using a grenade launcher, he ran close to the structure and fired at the top windows, causing an explosion that generated an immense fireball and smoke. This individual action illustrated how successful special operations often depend on the initiative and tactical competence of individual soldiers making critical independent decisions in fluid combat situations. During the patrolling of the airport perimeter, Israeli commandos discovered rows of Ugandan MiG-17 and MiG-21 fighters parked near the terminal. Recognizing the potential threat represented by these aircraft to future Israeli operations in the region, the armored vehicle commander requested permission by radio to destroy them. In the confusion of combat communications, he failed to obtain a clear response from the higher command, forcing him to make an independent tactical decision. Assuming responsibility for the action, he ordered machine gun fire against the Ugandan fighters. One of the planes, apparently full of fuel, exploded spectacularly, creating a fireball that dramatically illuminated the African night sky and set fire to adjacent aircraft. This destruction, although not foreseen in the original operational plan, eliminated a significant Ugandan military capability and sent a clear message about the Israeli determination to protect its national security interests. Tragically, during the final confrontations, one of the hostages was hit by crossfire and killed, adding another casualty to the operation that had already cost the life of Commander Netanyahu. This death illustrated the inherent risks in rescue operations in an active combat environment, where the proximity between hostages and terrorists makes it virtually impossible to guarantee the absolute safety of all victims. Despite this regrettable loss, the overall outcome of the operation remained extraordinarily positive, considering its complexity. Finally, after 57 minutes of operations on Ugandan soil, the last C-130 closed its doors and initiated takeoff procedures. Entebbe Airport, left behind in flames and destruction, had witnessed one of the most audacious and successful military operations of the modern era. All 7 terrorists present were eliminated, along with 45 Ugandan soldiers, while 102 hostages were now aboard the Israeli Hercules aircraft, finally heading toward freedom after a week of absolute terror. The C-130 formation made a technical stop in Nairobi for refueling, taking advantage of the discreet cooperation of the Kenyan government, who, although publicly neutral, secretly allowed the use of its facilities for this humanitarian operation. This technical stop was essential to complete the long return journey to Israel, demonstrating how long-range special operations often depend on carefully coordinated international logistical support. The reception on Kenyan territory also offered the first real opportunity for adequate medical care for hostages who had spent a week under precarious conditions. With confirmation of the operation's success arriving through military communication channels, the Israeli government publicly announced the raid and the successful liberation of the hostages to the world. This revelation caused an international sensation, both for the audacity of the operation and the technical competence demonstrated by the Israeli Special Forces. The news spread rapidly through global communication networks, generating reactions that ranged from admiration to condemnation, depending on the political perspectives and geopolitical alignments of international observers. At Ben Gurion Airport, family members who had spent a week in anguish anxiously awaited the return of the Israeli C-130s. The emotional reception of the liberated hostages constituted a moment of national celebration that symbolized Israel's determination to protect its citizens regardless of the risks and costs involved. The images of this family reunion, broadcast globally by international media, humanized a military operation that could have been perceived merely as a demonstration of force or technical capability. Idi Amin's reaction upon discovering the Israeli attack was one of absolute fury, both for the military humiliation suffered and the loss of international prestige resulting from the failure to protect the hostages under Ugandan custody. His response included the order to murder an elderly hostage who remained hospitalized in Kampala, in addition to systematic reprisals against Ugandan soldiers suspected of collaboration and the massacre of approximately 245 Kenyan citizens residing in Uganda, accused of facilitating the Israeli operation. These retaliations demonstrated the bloodthirsty nature of the Ugandan regime and retrospectively justified the Israeli decision not to rely on diplomatic negotiations. Sami's subsequent threats to militarily attack Kenya were dissuaded by the immediate response of the United States, which sent the aircraft carrier USS Ranger to Kenyan waters as a demonstration of support and deterrence. This American reaction illustrated how successful operations against international terrorism often receive tacit or explicit support from Western powers, even when executed unilaterally by regional allies. Although criticized by international organizations as a violation of Ugandan sovereignty and a dangerous precedent for unilateral military interventions, Operation Entebbe was widely celebrated by world public opinion as a demonstration that determined democracies could respond effectively to international terrorism. The operation dramatically reinforced Israel's reputation as a military power, willing to defend its national interests through extraordinary means, establishing a standard of response that would influence subsequent counter-terrorism policies of multiple countries. Immortalized by cinema and adopted as a training model by special forces around the world, Operation Entebbe remains one of the most studied episodes in contemporary military history. Its combination of strategic audacity, technical competence, and political determination continues to serve as a paradigm for high-complexity special operations, demonstrating that geographical distance and political adversity do not constitute insurmountable obstacles when national will and military capability are adequately combined in defense of fundamental democratic values.